Edgar wasn't like the rest of us. Hell, he wasn't like anyone. You could spend years around him and still not figure out what made him tick. He wasn't loud or brash, didn't throw his weight around or bark orders like some overblown action hero. No, Edgar was quiet, too quiet sometimes. The kind of quiet that made you feel like he was 3 steps ahead of you before you'd even decided to take the first one. He didn't need to shout to command a room. He just was. And when he looked at you, really looked at you, it felt like he could see every crack in your armor, every weakness you try to hide. He wasn't tall, maybe an inch or two above average, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made him seem larger than life. His movements were economical, deliberate, like every muscle in his body had been fine-tuned for maximum efficiency. No wasted energy, no unnecessary flourishes. Watching him fight, or even just move, was like watching a machine designed for one purpose: perfection. But Edgar wasn't a machine. That's what made him terrifying. He was human, completely and undeniably human, and yet somehow more. They said he was the result of decades of research and experimentation, the culmination of every breakthrough in genetics, psychology, and combat science we'd ever made. A perfect storm of nature and nurture, sharpened into something that didn't just surpass the limits of humanity. It redefined them. He didn't sleep much, not because he didn't need to, but because his mind wouldn't let him. Too many calculations, too many variables running through his head at all times. He could predict outcomes with eerie accuracy, anticipate movements before they happened. It wasn't just instinct. It was something deeper, something almost unnatural. And yet, for all his brilliance, Edgar never acted like he was better than anyone else. He didn't have to. That's why they came for him. It started on an otherwise uneventful morning at Base Theta 12, a remote installation buried deep in the mountains, far from prying eyes and alien scanners. The base itself was a fortress. Automated defenses, layered shielding systems, patrol drones, sweeping the skies 24/7. Nothing got in or out without authorization. Or so we thought. Edgar had been running drills with a group of new recruits when it happened. I remember watching him from the observation deck as he moved through their ranks like a ghost, correcting stances here, demonstrating techniques there. He wasn't harsh. He didn't need to be. His presence alone demanded respect and fear. The rookies fumbled under his scrutiny, their nerves betraying them as they tried to keep up with his impossible standards. And then the sky changed. At first, it was subtle, a faint shimmer high above the mountains that could have been mistaken for heat haze or atmospheric interference. But then the shimmer grew darker, deeper, until it became a gaping void that seemed to suck the light out of the air around it. No sound accompanied it. No roar of engines or crackle of energy, just an oppressive silence that pressed down on us like a physical weight. The first wave came through fast, sleek black machines that moved with an unsettling fluidity, their surfaces shifting and rippling as if they were alive. They weren't ships or drones. They were something else entirely. Something wrong. They hit our outer defenses hard and fast, tearing through automated turrets and shield barriers like they weren't even there. The alarms blared across the base as soldiers scrambled to respond, but it was already too late. The machines were inside before anyone could mount a proper defense. And then they stopped. Not completely. They still moved, still shifted, but they didn't attack us directly anymore. Instead, they spread out across the base in coordinated patterns as if searching for something or someone. Edgar knew. I saw it in his eyes as he turned toward the breach in the training yard fence where one of those things had just appeared. There was no fear there, no hesitation, just cold calculation as he assessed the situation and started moving toward it. "Get everyone inside," he said over his shoulder to one of the instructors before breaking into a sprint toward the intruder. It saw him coming, or maybe it had been looking for him all along, and shifted its form into something vaguely humanoid but impossibly sharp-edged, blades where arms should have been, its torso bristling with spines that glinted in the dim light. Edgar didn't slow down. What happened next is hard to describe because it didn't look real, not even in hindsight. One moment Edgar was running straight at this thing. The next he was inside its reach, twisting its bladed arm into a knot while simultaneously driving his elbow into what passed for its head with enough force to crumple steel. It fell apart under him, literally disintegrated into shards of black metal that dissolved into nothingness before they hit the ground. But more were coming now, dozens of them converging on his position from every direction. He fought like nothing I'd ever seen before or since. Every movement was precise, efficient. Every strike landed exactly where it needed to without an ounce of wasted effort. He wasn't just fighting them off. He was dismantling them piece by piece faster than they could adapt or overwhelm him. But even Edgar had limits, and they knew that. The second wave wasn't just machines anymore. It was something worse. Creatures made of light and shadow that moved faster than thought itself. They didn't attack directly. They didn't need to. They just surrounded him in a swirling vortex of energy that seemed to sap strength from everything around it. For the first time ever, Edgar faltered. I watched helplessly from my vantage point as those things closed in around him, not killing him, but containing him, and realized what we hadn't understood until now. This wasn't an invasion. It was an extraction mission. They weren't here to destroy us. They were here for him. And then they took him. One moment he was there, fighting tooth and nail against impossible odds. The next he was gone, swallowed by that swirling void in the sky along with his captors as if they'd never existed at all. The silence that followed was deafening. Edgar woke to the sensation of cold metal pressed against his skin and the low hum of alien machinery vibrating through the air. His eyes opened slowly, not because he was groggy. Edgar never truly felt groggy, but because he was assessing. Every detail mattered. The dim, pulsating blue light that illuminated the room. The acrid tang of sterilized air tinged with something faintly organic. The faint clicking sounds of machinery shifting in the distance. He didn't need to see the restraints to know they were there. He could feel them, heavy and unyielding, clamped around his wrists, ankles, and chest like a steel cocoon. This wasn't human engineering. No, it was far more advanced than anything Earth had ever produced. Seamless alloys that seemed to mold themselves to his body, locking him in place without a single visible seam or hinge. He tested the restraints subtly, flexing his fingers, shifting his shoulders. They didn't budge, not even a millimeter. Good. If they thought this would hold him, it meant they didn't understand him yet. That was their first mistake. The room itself was sterile and featureless, save for a single curved wall that shimmered faintly with what Edgar recognized as some kind of energy field. Beyond it, he could make out shadowy figures moving, tall, insectoid shapes with elongated limbs and segmented torsos that gleamed under the flickering light. Their movements were precise, almost mechanical, but there was an organic fluidity to them that made Edgar's stomach churn. These weren't machines. They were alive, or something close to it. He closed his eyes again, slowing his breathing until it was almost imperceptible. To anyone watching, he would appear unconscious or sedated. That was their second mistake. The figures outside the energy field were speaking, or at least communicating in some way, but their voices weren't audible in the traditional sense. Instead, Edgar felt them as vibrations in his skull, like a low-frequency hum that resonated just beneath the threshold of hearing. He couldn't make out words, if there even were words, but he could sense intent, curiosity, caution, and fear. They were afraid of him. That realization sparked something deep within Edgar, a quiet satisfaction that he buried immediately beneath layers of discipline and focus. Fear was a weapon, just like any other, and he would use it when the time came. The energy field shimmered brighter for a moment before dissolving entirely, and two of the creatures stepped into the room. Up close, they were even more grotesque than Edgar had imagined, towering over him on spindly legs that ended in razor-sharp talons, their elongated heads adorned with clusters of glowing eyes that blinked independently of one another. Their arms, if you could call them that, split into multiple jointed appendages tipped with delicate claws that clicked softly as they moved. One of them approached him cautiously while the other hung back near the doorway, its many eyes darting nervously between Edgar and its companion. The closer one extended a clawed appendage toward him, its movements slow and deliberate as if trying not to startle him. Edgar waited until it was close enough to touch before making his move. In one explosive motion, he twisted against the restraints with every ounce of strength he possessed. Not to break them, he knew they wouldn't give, but to shift his weight just enough to throw off their balance. The creature recoiled instinctively, its claws retracting as it stumbled backward, and that split-second hesitation was all Edgar needed. He wrenched his right arm forward with enough force to dislocate his own shoulder, a calculated sacrifice, and drove his elbow into the restraint's locking mechanism. It didn't break entirely, but it cracked just enough for him to twist free and slam his fist into the nearest creature's head before it could react. The impact sent it sprawling across the room in a tangle of limbs as Edgar turned his attention to the second one by the doorway. It hesitated for a fraction of a second too long, uncertain whether to attack or retreat, and Edgar closed the distance between them in 2 strides despite still being partially restrained. He didn't give it time to recover. With his free hand still bound by the broken restraint around his wrist, he swung upward in a brutal arc that connected with what he assumed was its throat, or at least something vital enough to make it collapse in on itself with a wet gurgling sound. The room fell silent except for the hiss of escaping air from one of the creature's punctured carapaces and Edgar's own labored breathing as he surveyed his surroundings. His shoulder throbbed where it hung limply at an unnatural angle, but pain was irrelevant now. Adrenaline had already taken over. He crouched down beside one of the fallen creatures and began searching its body with practiced efficiency until he found what he was looking for. A small device embedded in its chest cavity that pulsed faintly with blue light, the control mechanism for his restraints. With a sharp twist and a sickening crunch, he ripped it free and pressed it against the remaining lock on his ankle restraint. The device emitted a high-pitched whine before releasing him entirely. Edgar stood slowly, rolling his injured shoulder back into place with a grimace before turning toward the doorway where more shadows were beginning to gather beyond the shimmering energy field. They'd underestimated him once. They wouldn't get another chance. Edgar moved like a shadow through the alien corridors, his every step deliberate and soundless. The ship was vast, a labyrinth of smooth, seamless walls that pulsed faintly with an eerie bioluminescence. The air was thick with a strange metallic tang, and the hum of alien machinery reverberated through the structure like the heartbeat of some colossal beast. He had no map, no guide, only his instincts and an unrelenting drive to find a way out. The aliens had underestimated him. That much was clear from the moment he broke free of their restraints. They had designed their containment systems for brute strength or mindless resistance, not for someone like Edgar, someone who could turn his own body into a weapon, who could calculate the exact force needed to exploit even the smallest flaw in their technology. Now, he was loose on their ship, and they didn't even know it yet. He pressed himself against a curve in the wall as a group of alien guards passed by, their elongated forms casting distorted shadows in the dim light. Their movements were precise, almost mechanical, and their glowing eyes scanned the corridor with unsettling efficiency. But Edgar had already learned their patterns, how they moved, how they thought, and he slipped past them with ease, his breathing so controlled it barely stirred the air. The ship's design was alien in every sense of the word. There were no doors or hatches as humans understood them, only sections of wall that dissolved into shimmering voids when approached by the right beings. Edgar had already figured out how to trigger some of them by observing the guards, mimicking their gestures and movements with uncanny precision. But each new passage brought more questions than answers. What kind of creatures built this? What powered it? And most importantly, where was he? He found what he assumed was a storage bay first, a cavernous chamber filled with strange pods that floated weightlessly in midair, their surfaces rippling like liquid metal. He didn't linger there long. Whatever was inside those pods wasn't going to help him escape. Next came what looked like a laboratory, a sterile room lined with translucent panels displaying incomprehensible data streams. The equipment inside was unlike anything Edgar had ever seen. Organic shapes fused seamlessly with advanced technology, pulsing faintly as if alive. But it wasn't until he stumbled upon the pilot room that he felt his first glimmer of hope. The chamber was circular, its walls lined with what could only be described as control interfaces, panels that seemed to shift and morph as he approached, responding to his presence even though they didn't recognize him as one of their own. In the center of the room was a single chair, or something approximating a chair, facing an enormous viewport that stretched across one entire wall. Through it, Edgar saw the galaxy sprawled out before him in breathtaking detail. Stars burning bright against an infinite black canvas, nebulae swirling like cosmic storms, distant planets glowing faintly in the void. It was beautiful and utterly disorienting. The chair itself looked almost organic, its surface smooth and fluid as if it might mold itself to fit whoever sat in it. Edgar hesitated for only a moment before lowering himself into it, his muscles tensed for any sign of danger. The material shifted under him, adjusting to his form with an unsettlingly lifelike motion. And then the room came alive. Panels lit up around him in cascading waves of light and color, symbols and patterns flashing across their surfaces faster than he could process. The hum of machinery grew louder, more insistent, as if the ship itself were waking up to his presence. For a moment, Edgar thought he might have triggered some kind of alarm, but then he realized that nothing about this felt hostile. It was expectant. He reached out cautiously toward one of the panels, his fingers brushing against its surface. It responded instantly, shifting beneath his touch to display what looked like navigation data, a swirling map of stars and trajectories that made no sense to him but seemed to imply movement. Edgar frowned. He'd trained in countless scenarios back on Earth, piloting simulations included, but nothing could have prepared him for this. There were no joysticks or throttles here, no buttons or levers to manipulate. Instead, everything seemed to be controlled through touch and intent, a system so advanced it bordered on magic. He experimented cautiously at first, dragging his fingers across one panel to see how it reacted. The map shifted in response, zooming in on a cluster of stars that pulsed faintly as if waiting for him to choose one. Another panel displayed what he assumed were engine controls, lines of alien script interspersed with glowing symbols that pulsed rhythmically. It took him several minutes and more than a few missteps, but eventually Edgar managed to piece together enough of the interface to initiate movement. The ship shuddered slightly beneath him as its engines came online, a low vibration that resonated through his bones. But where should he go? The star map offered countless possibilities but no clear direction. He had no idea where Earth was in relation to any of this, or even if it was within reach at all. For all he knew, he could be on the other side of the galaxy or farther. Still, staying here wasn't an option. Edgar selected a star at random, a bright blue beacon that seemed closer than most, and initiated what he assumed was some kind of autopilot sequence. The ship responded immediately, its engines flaring to life as it began accelerating toward its new destination. The viewport filled with light as stars streaked past in brilliant lines of color, blurring together into an endless cascade that made Edgar's head spin if he looked at it too long. He gripped the edges of the chair tightly as the ship surged forward into the unknown. He was free, for now, but lost in a galaxy far beyond anything humanity had ever dreamed of exploring. The ship descended through the planet's atmosphere like a silent predator, its sleek, alien hull cutting through the thick clouds with an eerie grace. Edgar gripped the controls tightly, his jaw clenched as he guided the craft toward the surface. He didn't know what he was doing. Every adjustment to the ship's systems was guesswork, every button pressed a gamble, but somehow he managed to land it without disintegrating into a fireball. The planet was barren but habitable. Its sky glowed a pale green, and the air carried a faint metallic tang that reminded him of the ship itself. The terrain stretched out in jagged hills and valleys, dotted with sparse vegetation that looked more like coral than plants. There were no signs of advanced civilization, no cities, no structures, just an endless expanse of alien wilderness. It wasn't much, but it would do. Edgar stepped out of the ship cautiously, his boots crunching against the rocky ground. The air was thin but breathable, and the gravity was slightly lighter than Earth's, a small mercy that made moving easier despite his exhaustion. He scanned the horizon, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of danger. There was none. For now. He turned back to the ship, its alien design still as incomprehensible to him as when he'd first taken control of it. The sleek curves and glowing panels seemed almost organic, as if the vessel were alive in some way he couldn't fully understand. But it was his now, or at least under his temporary command, and if he was going to survive long enough to deal with his captors, he needed to understand it better. Inside the ship's labyrinthine interior, Edgar began his search. He moved methodically, opening compartments and examining every strange device he could find. Most of it was useless to him. Alien technology, so advanced it might as well have been magic, but eventually he stumbled upon what he'd been hoping for, a manual. It wasn't a book or even a digital file in any human sense. Instead, it was a series of glowing holographic panels that activated when he touched them, displaying symbols and diagrams in a language he couldn't read. But Edgar wasn't just anyone. His mind worked differently. He studied the patterns carefully, piecing together their meaning through context and repetition. It wasn't perfect, he couldn't decipher everything, but it gave him enough to work with. The manual included a map of the ship's systems and navigation controls, as well as what appeared to be a star chart detailing nearby systems and planets. Edgar memorized as much as he could before shutting it down. Keeping it active too long might alert someone or something to his presence. But before he left this planet, there was something else he needed to do. The aliens who had taken him wouldn't stop hunting him just because he'd escaped their ship. They would come for him again. Of that, Edgar had no doubt. And when they did, he intended to be ready. This planet might not have much in the way of resources, but it had enough for what he needed: cover, vantage points, and raw materials for makeshift traps. For days, Edgar worked tirelessly to prepare for their arrival. He scouted the terrain around the ship's landing site, identifying choke points and ambush locations where he could gain the upper hand against superior numbers or technology. He fashioned crude weapons from whatever materials he could find: sharp-edged stones tied to sturdy branches for spears, weighted rocks bound together with strips torn from his uniform for slings. He studied the ship's systems further during breaks between preparations, learning how to manipulate its sensors and defenses. The manual had been vague on some points. Its creators clearly hadn't designed it with human operators in mind, but Edgar's relentless focus allowed him to uncover hidden functions that might give him an edge. By the time he finished setting up his defenses, Edgar felt more like himself again. Not just a fugitive running from capture, but a soldier preparing for war. The aliens had taken him because they thought they could control him, study him like some kind of specimen. They didn't understand what they were dealing with. They would soon learn their mistake. Edgar sat atop one of the jagged hills overlooking his landing site, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon as twilight fell over the alien landscape. The green sky darkened to a deep emerald hue dotted with unfamiliar stars, their light casting long shadows across the rocky terrain below. He didn't know when they would come, or how many there would be, but one thing was certain: when they did arrive, they wouldn't leave this planet alive. And neither would Edgar, unless he won this fight on his own terms. The alien ship's sensors flared to life, warning Edgar of an incoming fleet before he even saw the first glimmer of their approach. He had been expecting this. For days, he had prepared for this moment, knowing full well that his captors wouldn't let him go so easily. They weren't just coming to retrieve their stolen ship. They were coming for him, their prized specimen, the human anomaly who had defied their restraints and escaped their grasp. Edgar stood at the edge of the rocky plateau where he had made his temporary camp, his sharp eyes scanning the emerald sky. The planet's twin suns were low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the jagged terrain. The air was still, heavy with anticipation. He could feel the tension in his muscles, the electric charge in his veins as his body prepared itself for what was to come. The first ship broke through the atmosphere like a falling star, its sleek black hull reflecting the greenish hue of the sky. Then another, and another. Soon, the horizon was filled with them. Dozens of alien craft descending in perfect formation, their engines humming with an otherworldly resonance that sent vibrations through the ground beneath Edgar's feet. He didn't flinch. Instead, he turned and made his way back to his stolen ship, his movements calm and deliberate. He had spent days studying its systems, learning its controls with a speed and precision that only someone like him could manage. The manual he had found on board was written in an alien language, but Edgar's mind worked differently than most. Patterns emerged where others would see chaos. Meaning revealed itself through sheer force of will and intellect. By now, he knew enough to pilot the ship with confidence, and more importantly, he had learned how to weaponize it. Inside the cockpit, Edgar activated the ship's defensive systems. Panels lit up around him in cascading waves of light as he entered commands with practiced efficiency. The alien technology responded to him almost intuitively now, as if it had begun to recognize him as its new master. He brought up a holographic display of the surrounding area, watching as the enemy fleet closed in on his position. They were faster than he'd anticipated. Good. He wanted them close. Edgar had chosen this planet for a reason. Its barren landscape offered little in the way of resources or cover, but it provided something far more valuable: control. The jagged hills and narrow valleys created natural choke points that he could exploit to funnel his enemies into kill zones. He had spent days setting traps, hidden explosives rigged from scavenged materials, ambush points marked with precision. And now all that preparation was about to pay off. The first wave of alien ships descended toward his position, their sleek forms bristling with weapons that glowed ominously in the dim light. Edgar watched them approach on the holographic display, his sharp mind calculating trajectories and attack patterns in real time. They were cautious, testing him, probing for weaknesses, but they didn't yet understand who they were dealing with. He made sure they would learn quickly. As soon as the lead ship crossed into range, Edgar triggered one of his traps, a series of improvised mines buried beneath a narrow pass leading to his camp. The explosion tore through the air with deafening force, sending shards of rock and debris flying in all directions. The lead ship disintegrated on impact, its shattered remains crashing into the valley below. The others hesitated for only a moment before pressing forward, their weapons firing in coordinated bursts that lit up the sky like a storm of fire and light. Edgar moved quickly now, guiding his stolen ship into position above them while activating its own arsenal. Energy beams lanced out from its hull with pinpoint accuracy, striking enemy craft one after another in rapid succession. But there were too many of them. For every ship he destroyed, two more seemed to take its place. They swarmed around him like angry hornets, their movements fast and unpredictable as they closed in from all sides. Edgar's mind raced as he calculated angles and probabilities faster than any computer could manage, his hands moving over the controls with blinding speed. This wasn't just a battle anymore, it was survival. And yet, Edgar thrived on this kind of chaos. He guided his ship through a series of evasive maneuvers that would have been impossible for anyone else to execute. Barrel rolls and sharp dives that brought him within inches of colliding with enemy craft before twisting away at the last second. Each movement was calculated down to the millimeter, each decision made in fractions of a second. But even Edgar couldn't keep this up forever. His stolen ship shuddered violently as enemy fire grazed its hull, sending sparks flying across the cockpit. Warning lights flashed on every panel around him as systems began to overload under the strain of constant combat. He gritted his teeth against the rising heat inside the cabin and pushed forward anyway, because retreat wasn't an option. Not yet. Not until they understood what it meant to face him. With one final burst of speed, Edgar guided his ship into a narrow canyon where he had set his final trap, a hidden cache of explosives rigged along both sides of its walls. As soon as he reached its center point, he triggered them all at once. The resulting explosion was cataclysmic. A wall of fire and debris erupted from both sides of the canyon, consuming everything in its path, including most of the pursuing fleet. The shockwave sent Edgar's ship careening out of control for several agonizing seconds before he managed to stabilize it again. When silence finally fell over the battlefield, only one figure remained standing amidst smoke-filled skies and scattered wreckage. Edgar, the perfect soldier, alive against impossible odds. The battlefield was silent now, save for the faint crackle of flames licking at the shattered remains of the alien fleet. Smoke curled into the emerald sky, twisting like ghostly tendrils as the twin suns dipped lower on the horizon. Edgar stood atop a jagged outcrop overlooking the carnage, his silhouette stark against the dying light. His chest rose and fell with measured breaths, his body streaked with dirt and blood. Some of it his own, most of it not. He had won. The aliens had underestimated him at every turn. They had come with their advanced ships, their superior numbers, their incomprehensible technology, and he had torn through them like a force of nature. Their sleek black vessels now lay scattered across the rocky terrain in twisted heaps of metal and organic matter, their glowing weapons extinguished, their pilots reduced to nothing more than memories. Edgar descended from the outcrop, his boots crunching against the scorched ground as he made his way toward the largest of the wrecked ships. It had been their command vessel, larger and more heavily armed than the others, its hull adorned with alien glyphs that pulsed faintly even in death. This was where their leaders had been, where they had directed their futile assault against him. He stepped inside through a jagged hole torn in its side by one of his traps. The interior was dark and still, its once glowing panels flickering weakly as if struggling to hold on to life. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burned circuitry and alien flesh. Edgar moved through the wreckage with purpose, his sharp eyes scanning for what he needed. He found it near what he assumed was the ship's central command console, a device that pulsed faintly with an otherworldly blue light. It was some kind of communication system designed to transmit messages across vast distances. Edgar didn't fully understand how it worked, but he didn't need to. He had learned enough during his time aboard their ship to know how to activate it. The device hummed to life under his touch, its surface rippling like liquid as it adjusted to his presence. Symbols and patterns appeared in rapid succession, shifting and morphing until they settled into something that resembled a recording interface. Edgar leaned forward, his face illuminated by the faint blue glow. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice low and steady, but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. "You came for me because you thought I was weak. You thought I was something you could study, something you could control." He paused, letting his words sink into the silence. "You were wrong." His gaze hardened as he leaned closer to the device, his tone sharpening into something cold and final. "I am human," he continued, "and humans are not prey. We are not experiments. We are not yours to take." He straightened, his voice rising with quiet intensity as he delivered his final message. "Never mess with humans again." With that, he deactivated the device and stepped back as it began transmitting his words across whatever vast network connected these creatures to their distant homeworlds. They would hear him, whoever they were, and they would know what had happened here. They would know who had destroyed them. Satisfied, Edgar turned and made his way back to his stolen ship. The battle had taken its toll on both him and the vessel. Its hull was scorched and battered, its systems barely holding together after hours of relentless combat. But it would fly. He made sure of that before engaging in this fight. The cockpit felt almost familiar now as he settled into the pilot's seat and began powering up the engines. The holographic panels flickered weakly but responded to his touch as he entered coordinates for Earth, the one place in this vast galaxy that mattered to him. As the ship lifted off from the planet's surface, Edgar glanced out through the viewport at the battlefield below one last time. The wreckage of alien ships stretched out in every direction, a testament to what humanity could achieve when pushed to its limits. He didn't smile. There was no satisfaction in killing, even when it was necessary. But there was pride in knowing that he had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious, not just for himself but for all of humanity. The journey back to Earth took longer than expected. The ship's damaged systems forced him to make several stops along the way for repairs, using whatever materials he could scavenge from uninhabited planets or derelict vessels drifting in deep space. But Edgar didn't mind. Patience was one of his many virtues. When he finally broke through Earth's atmosphere weeks later, it was as if time itself had stopped on the planet below. His arrival wasn't subtle. The alien ship's sleek design and otherworldly energy signature lit up every radar station on Earth within seconds. But by then, word of his disappearance had already spread far and wide. They were waiting for him when he landed, a crowd of soldiers, scientists, government officials, and civilians who had heard rumors of what had happened but hadn't dared believe them until now. Edgar stepped out onto Earth's soil once more, standing tall despite the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. He carried no trophies from his battle, no alien weapons or artifacts, because he didn't need them. His survival alone was proof enough of what he'd accomplished. The crowd erupted into cheers as he approached them, a deafening roar that echoed across the landing site like thunder rolling through a stormy sky. But Edgar barely acknowledged it. He wasn't here for glory or recognition. He was here because humanity needed him, and because now they knew what they were capable of when faced with impossible odds. From that day forward, Edgar wasn't just a soldier or a weapon. He was a symbol, a reminder that humanity wasn't weak or insignificant in this vast galaxy full of dangers they couldn't yet comprehend. And somewhere out there, those aliens would remember him too. They would remember Edgar, the perfect soldier who turned their arrogance into ashes, and they would think twice before ever crossing paths with humanity again.